Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this post-show discussion for Fishamble's production of Outrage by Deirdre Kinahan. My name is Jim Culleton. I'm the Artistic Director of Fishamble and the Director of the production, and I'm delighted to be joined by Deirdre Kinahan here beside me. We're here in the Fishamble office after rehearsals, who is one of Ireland's top playwrights. We've had the great pleasure of working with Deirdre on many plays over the years, and of course our plays are performed by many companies in Ireland and all over the world. And we're also joined, I'm delighted to say, by Dr. Mary McAuliffe, who's a historian and a lecturer and the Director of Gender Studies in UCD. Thank you very much, Mary, for joining us for this chat.
Delighted.
Great stuff. So I suppose we've looked at kind of plays from this decade of centenaries, I suppose, a few times, with yourself, Deirdre, looking at the play Embargo in 2020, which was about the arms embargo when Irish railway workers and dockers refused to handle British weapons and transport British soldiers. And we've also looked at some plays with the playwright Colin Murphy in 2016 taking over the GPO for the production of Inside the GPO, and then looking late last year at the treaty, about the Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations, which were in the National Concert Hall in the room where the Dáil debates happened, and then in London. And I suppose Outrage is a play that also looks at the events of 100 years ago. And I suppose, like all history plays, helps us to understand the world now and who we are and what we've come from and the decisions and choices that people 100 years ago in this country had and how that has affected life over the past century. So it's a particularly kind of exciting way to look at the period. And in this play particularly, and in other plays as well that you've written, Deirdre, because obviously this is in a way the third in your war trilogy plays, starting off with Wild Sky and then with Embargo and now Outrage. You've looked particularly at the role of women during the period of the Civil War and during the events of 100 years ago. So would you like just maybe chat with us and share some thoughts about the starting point, the idea for the play, and what interested you particularly in the role of women during that time, or what you felt you wanted to say that perhaps hadn't been said elsewhere?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's been quite a journey for me, a really humbling, privileged position to be in, to have a voice in these commemorations. And, you know, from the get-go, when I was writing Wild Sky, you know, that was kind of like a broken romance between two characters from Slane, County Meath, and it looked at how people became radicalized. And, you know, the story of Josie Dunn was just as important as the story of Tom Farrell. And I suppose that I wanted to write about ordinary people's experience of that period and the tumult, but also the idealism that underpinned it. And when I leapt from there into the War of Independence and wrote Embargo, I suppose I became swept up with the whole labour movement and the sense of civil militancy and just what an important part that played in the War of Independence, and began to question, why don't I know about this? Why don't I know that 20 Soviets were declared all over the country? And I began to think about the stories that emerged from 1916, the War of Independence, the Civil War, the stories that we were told at school, and the various narratives that surrounded it. And so when I came to writing about the Civil War, I was thinking about narrative, and I was thinking about how narratives are created and who they serve, and what an important part of war they are, and what an important part of the aftermath of war. And then, oddly enough, I was commissioned by Meath County Council Arts Office to write this play, and they had commissioned Wild Sky as well. And they told me the story of an old printing press that was found quite recently in a house on Magdalen Street in Kells. And what was interesting about this was it was a little old house that had been lying intestate for about 10 or 15 years. Some priest had inherited it in the UK. And when he came back to sell it, and they opened up the house, they went out the back and there were these printing sheds. And in the printing sheds were 3 extraordinary old printing presses, one of which is like, you know, worth a fortune. There's only 8 of them left in the world. Can't remember the name of it. But then there was also filing cabinets stuffed full of posters, receipts, pamphlets, flyers. The man who ran the printing shed literally dropped dead of a heart attack. So you were looking at something that sat exactly the day he left work. And the Meath County Council were very excited about this find. And initially they had thought that maybe the play could in some way coincide with the opening of this new print museum that is due to open in Kells. So I began to think about propaganda, printing, and as I researched the role of women, it was like this extraordinary coincidence, this beautiful coincidence, because I found that women worked a great deal in the whole world of propaganda, both during the War of Independence and during the Civil War. And I had read a fabulous book by a woman called Kathleen McKenna. I think it's called The Revolutionary Recollections of a Doll Girl. And she was from County Meath. She was from Oldcastle. And I had kind of used her youth when I was reimagining the character of Josie in 1916. And now I delved into her experience of the War of Independence and the Civil War. And she worked in the Department of Propaganda in Ireland's first illegal doll. And they literally went head to head with Dublin Castle in terms of getting the stories out, getting the news out. And I thought, ooh, this is a very good place to start writing my play. So with me, when I'm writing these plays, I'm always inspired by a historical reality, you know, real testimonies. I read a lot of testimonies by women that I found in the Bureau of Military History archives. And I began to formulate this idea of a story of two sisters who were involved in the entire struggle. You couldn't deal with the Civil War on its own. These women were involved from the get-go, and they weren't making sandwiches and they weren't rolling bandages. They were involved in every aspect of the fight. So I began to create a story of two sisters, and one of whom marries this lovely chap, PJ from Kells, who owns a printing press. And I wanted to look at how the Civil War kind of tore that relationship apart, and yet how their love of each other and their humanity somehow survived it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much, Dee. Thank you. And Mary, just coming to you, you've had a chance to read the play. Obviously, we're in rehearsals, so nobody's had a chance to see it yet. But a lot of your work has focused on the role of women during this revolutionary period. And I suppose Deirdre's talking about how she hoped the play would in a way be a piece of work that would kind of correct the imbalance or the lack of documentation about some of the key roles of women during that time. It's no surprise to you, obviously, how involved women were in it, because you've written some amazing works about that. What did you think when you read the play? Did you feel this was kind of a truthful analysis of the kind of way women were actually played key roles during that period in our history?
Yeah, it was very funny reading the play. I mean, I don't, and obviously now I know you read the Bureau of Military History witness statements. When, you know, I'd come across little parts of it where something was happening, like taking the story forward. And I thought, oh, that's very reminiscent of this, or this sounds like you know, this story, this is exactly what happened, but it's transported into your imagining of, you know, of different characters and different stories. And certainly the Civil War, the baddie, the nasty person Finney, I just thought, do you know about Paddy O'Daly?
I do, yeah, absolutely. That was,
I thought,
yeah.
Is that an influence there in that, and the Kenmare case and the Axel Grace? I really thought that really resonated with me. But I think, you know, what you were talking about, like the importance of women working in the world of propaganda, and oftentimes that is, well, so much of what women did is overlooked, but more and more we recognize that they had such a huge part to play in the War of Independence, as, you know, without them, the guerrilla warfare couldn't have happened in the way that it did, with the safe houses and arms transportation and intelligence gathering and all that sort of thing. But they were also essential in the propaganda. And that propaganda work was absolutely essential to sort of bringing the civilian population along with them, firstly, but also influencing global newspapers and politicians about what was happening in Ireland. And of course, using the Irish Bulletin as their vehicle of propaganda during the War of Independence. But even on into the Civil War, an awful lot of the women continue that propaganda work on both sides of the conflict. And this is an argument I've been making recently, and I think you capture it quite well with Nell and Alice, in that they come down on opposite sides of the treaty. But the relationship does survive. And you know, I see the Civil War not just as this old trope of brother against brother, which it is, but also if we have to include the split the women go through, and the split in their ideologies, and the upset it brings into their relationships with each other. And you see, for example, Cumann na mBan splits of Cumann na mBan and Cumann na Saoirse, the pro-treaty women. It's bitter. It's really bitter what happens to them when that splits. And then the irregular women, the women like Nell, who end up in prison and on hunger strike, are treated so badly, and they are so seen as monstrous, as crazies, as furies. P.S. O'Hegarty is particularly vitriolic about them. You know, that they've lost their minds. They're blooded women. They have become non-women almost, and that they need to be made women again. And that, of course, is part of the domestication of women that the Free State undertakes going forward. But I thought in the violence against these women, both literal and psychological, is horrific during the Civil War. You don't get as much of the hair cropping that happened in the War of Independence, but what you get are more vitriolic physical and indeed sexual assaults that happen. And in reading the intelligence files in the military archives, as I have been doing over the last period, when we could go to the archives in between lockdowns, and reports back about what is happening in various parts of the country. And you can see you know, in one report, for example, a man was accused of, during a raid, of indecent assault on the woman of the house. And he said, but she's just a Republican bitch. You know, she's just somebody, she's dehumanized. She is somebody not worth consideration. And you couldn't take her at her word anyway, her word against mine as a member of the National Army. And you find an awful lot. It is so, in many ways, it's harder to actually talk about this and write about this and research about this than the violence during the War of Independence, because that was a war. And violence happens in war, including sexual violence. This was ourselves doing it to ourselves. Almost immediately that the Civil War, on both sides, but the National Army especially, are committing 6 acts of physical, psychological, emotional and sexual assault on women during their searches of homes and reprisals. And of course in Kerry, and I'm a Kerry woman myself, so I grew up with the stories of the Dublin Brigade in Kerry, and the massacre at CD and Knocknagoshel and you know, Countess Bridge and all of that sort of thing. But what I didn't hear about was what the Dublin Brigade were doing to the women. And it's not just the infamous Kinmare case in which Paddy O'Daly, the head of the Dublin Brigade, was involved in, but there were a number of cases in which they arrest and take into custody for 4 or 5 days into Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee, women who were considered irregulars, who were supporting the irregular cause. And the women talk about how they were rough treated. And the language is always kind of obscures what is really going on, but they talk about their rough treatment and then being thrown out, and they might have to walk 15 miles, 20 miles home. But all throughout the country, and I've looked in the records from the west of Ireland and the Midlands, where wasn't as what we call hot in terms of Civil War violence, there is still violence against women. There's a horrific gang rape by the National Army in Mayo, but it's not the only one. There are actually a couple of others of actual rapes by the National Army, but also indecent assault, physical assault, you know, just that real absolute dismissal and hatred and dehumanizing of anti-treaty women. And that feeds in then to a broader public perception of these women. And in your play, you know, when the priest and the people come to PJ after, well, I won't reveal, you know, all of what happens, but when they come to talk about Nell and how Nell was mad, and that really they you know, they should put her away in a psychiatric institution. That happened to quite a number of women. And it was not unusual. It was not unusual
No, absolutely.
And you know, this is really problematic. And then you're right, an awful lot of them immigrate. They have to leave. They can't stay. Like the anti-treaty men, they go too. But you know, there was so much resonances in your play that as I read it, I went, oh yes, you're really capturing what was happening for women. An awful lot of women, not everywhere in the country, because some places remained fairly quiet, but in an awful lot of places throughout, particularly in Munster and up the west coast, throughout the Civil War. And it must have been horrific. It just must have been horrific. I think in the War of Independence, there was an ability maybe to accept the violence and that it was part of a war they were fighting, a war of liberation. In the Civil War, it must have been just so psychologically damaging. And that's not to say the anti-treaty IRA didn't commit their own bouts of sexual violence against women.
Yeah.
They do.
They do.
But not as much as the National Army, in fairness to them, yeah.
Absolutely. I think the Civil War, just as you say, families fighting against families, it just seems like we weren't fighting the British as an enemy, I suppose, was fighting among ourselves, which makes it all the more horrendous. And that's one of the things that I think you've captured really well in the play, Deirdre. You know, there's a huge responsibility to write about something that's real or that's based on reality, isn't it? And I suppose like certainly when I started working on this with you, it was a real shock to me that gender-based violence and sexual assault had been such a prominent part of the Civil War, and that certainly, I suppose, it didn't suit the historians or the official version of events, which maybe is why we didn't hear about it in our history classes, you know. And even the title of the play, of course, the word outrage, like there are words out in the play, like a woman was humiliated or she was compromised, an outrage took place. Even the euphemisms used, I suppose, to cover up are kind of fascinating. But that's something you felt really, I suppose, that's a burning issue at the centre of the play, isn't it? I mean, that sense of trying to do justice to that and tell those stories of how that happened to women.
Yeah, and it was very much inspired, Mary, by your documentary that you made with T.G. Cahir about the war on women in that period and about gendered violence. And like that, I'd heard whispers of it, but never really had anybody kind of so blatantly and publicly said, do you know what? This, you know, rape and sexual assault are a tool of war. They have been since the dawn of time. Why on earth would we believe that they were not a part of our wars? And that really kind of resonated with me. And the sense that the church kind of came galloping in, like they're the opportunists. They had never supported revolution in Ireland. They had never supported the working classes. But they came in and suddenly it was a holy war, like it was for God and Ireland. So there was this kind of crazy confusion of religious fervor and revolution. And I couldn't help but think, I mean, the only reason any of us look at this is because we're trying to understand who we are and what we are now. And that's the golden opportunity of a commemorative period like this, because Ireland is in such a different place now. It's a very progressive place now. We've had the extraordinary phenomena of, you know, the Repeal the Eighth campaign, the gay marriage referendum. I mean, they've been seismic, you know, in terms of really unleashing and releasing a kind of inherent decency and humanity that I think was deeply compromised by the gross conservatism of that Catholic caliphate that kind of emerged from our period of revolution. And I've often wondered, what happened? Oh my God, it was so internationalist, it was so egalitarian, it was so inspired, that revolutionary period. Who were the victors? Why did we let them create that brutal state, you know? And why were women so deeply betrayed? I'm no expert. I don't know, but I have an inkling that we as a nation were so traumatized by our own revolution, you know, that's what enabled that state to emerge. Yet, that story of women being brutalized and then undermined and disbelieved and put away, it resonates throughout every decade. the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So when we go into the end of the play, into that kind of moment where initially there was great sympathy for the woman at the heart of the outrage, then because it didn't suit the narrative of the new nation, how slowly but surely that story was unraveled, do you know? And that happened again and again and again. We're looking at it all the time now with the various reports into mother and baby homes, into, you know, various institutions, even right up to the brutal assault of that beautiful girl in Tullamore, Aisling Murphy. Like, gendered violence is still with us. And it is facilitated and enabled by our response to it. And there's something about that response that we can look right back and see why it reverberates even to this day.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, those problems are still with us, aren't they? So much so, as I say, with gender-based violence, and also in terms of wars. You look over the past few weeks at the really horrendous and very distressing images of what's happening in the Ukraine, and so many parallels to what was happening here 100 years ago. The circumstances are different, but the fact that, you know, what war does to people, I suppose, is still very much alive and present with us in those very upsetting kind of reports. As a historian yourself, Mary, do you find that, you know, that history just inevitably repeats itself, or do you feel we learn things from history, or do you hope we do in some way?
Well, sometimes it can be very difficult, because already we're beginning to get reports out from the Ukraine that sexual violence is being used by, or it's happening with the invaders of Ukraine. And once you see mass movements of people as happening, of women and children, they're so vulnerable on routes through Europe now and getting to safety, and not all of them will get to safety, unfortunately, as we know from like the migrant routes that have been taken in the last few years by people fleeing Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen and various other parts of the world in which violence was broke out, and you have women and children on those routes, and human trafficking, and people prey on them, you know. And it's similar to, you know, it's what happens in war all the time, in revolution. But going back to what Deirdre was saying about what happened, the radical promise, well, it was pretty much gone by 1920, 21 anyway, because, you know, the radical promise was there in the Proclamation of Independence and full and equal citizenship. And an awful lot of the women believed in that, believed that they would have a different Ireland. And that's why they reject the treaty. And one of the reasons they reject the treaty, as well as the Oath of Allegiance, they didn't want to take that, because it was a betrayal of what they'd given their lives, blood, and worked for, blood, sweat, and tears. But you have to remember as well, we were a post-colonial society. We were a very poor society. There was one very big, wealthy organization that could offer the government its expertise and education and social policy and healthcare. And of course, that was the church. And if you hand over the hearts, minds, and bodies of people to a faith-based institution like the church, no problem. We also had very conservative revolutionaries. They weren't, you know, about transforming the type of culture and political culture and socioeconomic culture we had. They were about replacing the leadership, those English with us. And so in constructing what it meant to be Irish post 1922, basically they took the most conservative route of masculinity and femininity. And for women, it was all about respectability. Respectability in your behavior, in getting married, having kids, being the angel of the hearth. And the type of women who weren't really that respectable were those women who had participated in the War of Independence, and particularly who were anti-treaty during the Civil War. And any discussion around gender-based violence or sexual violence gets silenced. Now, it doesn't go away. And it was amazing before COVID lockdown, when I used to go around the country quite a lot, giving local talks to local history societies in person, not on Zoom, which was great. There would always be 2, maybe 3, 4 women who would come up, and it was almost always women who would come up afterwards if I spoke about, you know, the gender-based violence and the hair cropping and the sexual assaults and criminal assaults on women by whichever armed gang was going around at that time and in that place. they would come up and say, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my grandaunt told us about that. They told us that, you know, you couldn't walk out in the dark because that's when sexual assaults would happen. They told us all about the use of hair cropping to, you know, stop young girls company keeping. And then in the Civil War, the use of violence against women to control irregular women, anti-treaty women. So those memories were kept within families. They weren't put into the archives. Some were, they made it in almost by accident, but they didn't make it into the history books. And it is thanks to like feminist scholars, beginning with Louise Rhine's seminal article in 2000 on drunken tans. And since then, people like myself have been really delving deep into the archives. And it's all there. All the information is there to show that the Irish War of Independence and Civil War was not a gender clean war that had been, you know, sort of talked about in that way, that there was some violence by these drunken tans, but generally it was a fairly clean war. It was not at all. And this is only the material that survives. Remember, most women would not actually report a sexual assault or a rape, certainly not to the RIC. And one interesting thing I'm finding in the War of Independence is they do report it to the Republican police and the Sinn Féin courts, but they're not taken that seriously. One incident which kind of reminded me of how the church dealt with the child sex abuse scandals later on is a man that had been attacking a number of women. He was a member of the IRA in Dublin, was just moved around by the Republican police, and you know, that's the way they were dealing with it. And then in the Civil War, well, gender-based violence had already proved an effective way of stopping girls company keeping. It is going to prove an effective way of stopping the anti-treaty women as well. And I mean, they are physically assaulted in jails. They are sexually and physically assaulted outside. So the Irish War is like any war anywhere in the world where you will have an element, large or small, of gender-based violence. And we see that all the time. So I think we need to talk about as well, you know, why war happens in the way it happens. And of course, it's all connected up with patriarchy and constructs of militant masculinity and all of that sort of thing. And the idea of, you know, demoralizing the enemy through the bodies of these women. And that's how it's such an effective weapon as well. And I think you capture that in the play very, very powerfully, actually. I found, you know, the description of what happened quite hard to read, but and I'm sure on the stage it'll be very powerful as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. But we have to remember, in wars, again and again and again. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, yes, history does seem to repeat itself in cases like that. So what do we do about it? How do we stop it? I don't know if I have the answers to that, except, you know, blow up the patriarchy and start again from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
And so war is not part of the human condition, you know.
Yeah.
Where there will be war, there will be gender-based violence, unfortunately, within the context of most societies and cultures around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's and I suppose that is something you capture so well in the play, I think, and the writings of people like yourself, Mary, and historians, and the works of art by playwrights and other artists, I suppose, is a way of doing that, you know. And yeah, and it's interesting to say that piece, of course, is so powerfully written, and in rehearsals it's been really interesting, kind of and challenging, that we were working through maybe like 10 pages, you know, in a half a day, and then we got to the sort of that key kind of moment in the play, and it took us about a day and a half to work through a page and a half, you know. And it just, so it's been a really fascinating process how to do justice to that and theatricalize it and make it truthful, as we're trying to do with everything. One of the things, I suppose, we're in the final week of rehearsals now, you know, when people are watching this, they will have seen the play and it'll be on. One of the things we're interested in and grappling with at the moment is how to stage the play, and also thinking of the excitement ahead of us, I suppose, with the venues we're in. So this is a co-production. It's with Fishamble Theatre Company, but it's produced in association with Meath County Council and with the Dublin Port Company, and it's part of the Decade of Centenaries programme as well, and supported by Dublin City Council and the Arts Council. But we're working in two particularly fascinating places. One is the Pumphouse, where the 3rd Battalion of the Dublin Brigade that PJ works for were based making bombs, and of course we worked there before on your play, Deirdre, Embargo.
That's right, yeah.
With Irish Rail and Dublin Port Company, and then the other venue is the Kells Courthouse. So I think that's kind of always interesting, isn't it? Kind of moving to outside of theatre and into a place that's resonant with the kind of the history of the place, and that people feel connected to a place in a way that maybe they might have walked past a place before and then suddenly feel connected in a different way, Yeah,
because I always feel like this is our story. Nell, Alice, and PJ, they're us. They're like little flickering flames inside us. It's from this we have emerged. Do you know?
Yeah.
And it's only by embracing the truth of your past can you ever hope to move on from it. Like, I really believe that. And one of the things that I find so sad, really sad, is that tool of war filtered out and became a tool of the new state, effectively. And we've really only faced into that, looked at that, and tried to change that in the last 20, 30 years, and silence was such a key to preserving that. And like, women really, no matter what way they turned, I mean, I remember my mother used to always say it's a man's world. I mean, everything was constructed to keep you in your place, to infantilize you, effectively disempower you, and that's not an easy thing to face about your own nation and your own culture, but that's the truth of it, and we are emerging from it. The job ain't done, or nowhere near it, but I think the truth of it has certainly been looked at more blatantly in a very recent history than ever before.
Yeah, I think the concept of shame and was so powerful, and not being respectable. But shame, these women felt shamed by what had happened to them, so shame kept them silent. And that language you mentioned earlier about using the language of outrage, of indignity, of rough treatment. So saying it without saying it, because of course you didn't want to say the word. And I can think of only one case in the Civil War where the word rape was used in the reporting of an actual rape case, and that was Mrs. Biggs in Tipperary, which happened. It was actually the anti-treaty IRA attacked the house. And it was a gang rape, and it is reported in one or two of the articles on it in those terms. But that's among the very, very few where that word is actually used. So most of the time you're trying to come around the word and dig underneath it and see what's really happening here. And even the hair cropping that's reported in the War of Independence, they talk about, they cut off my hair and I suffered other indignities. And, in that space, what's happening there, in the middle of the night, surrounded by 15 men, you get your hair roughly cropped off, and then there are other indignities. So what's happening? And I think we are asking those questions. And that is, I think, a really good marker of our maturing as maybe a nation in many ways, in that we're unafraid, many of us, not everybody, but we're unafraid to look at that trauma history and look at that history without trying to fetishize it or glorify revolution, but see the actual impact on the combatants as well as the civilians, male and female of the time, and understand that, it had generational impacts. It wasn't just on the people themselves, but it has generational impacts. And same with the institutionalization of many women and children in the industrial schools and Magdalen laundries and mother and baby homes subsequently. That trauma and that experience will be generational as well. And while I would say the responses of officialdom to those institutional histories, or indeed the shameful histories and the trauma histories of our revolutionary period, have been slow. The historians and actually people, ordinary people, have really taken on board these histories and want to grapple with them. And I see that happening a bit with the Civil War as well, because everybody, when the decade of centenaries started in 2012, everyone was like, oh, we'll only go up to 2021 because after that it's the Civil War. Yeah. And are we ready? Are we mature enough? Are we, you know, can we talk about the Civil War without having another Civil War about it?
Exactly, yeah.
And I think we are. I mean, there are obviously the fights that are going on in some marginalized spaces. But I think we are having that conversation about Civil War and what happened, because we recognize that it wasn't just one side and the other side. There's huge gray areas, there are complications, there are families, there are sisters and brothers, and there's horrific things that we need to deal with, and not just Civil War politics and which political party your parents voted for and your grandparents voted for the next generations. And I think in many ways, our maturity as a nation in the century that we have been a nation is marked by the fact that we are able to deal with these issues. And, you know, I think we're being also guided by, in fairness to him, a very good president who's doing great speeches on it, because of course his own family split as well during the Civil War. But I think, and I will claim it for the feminist historians, I think we've led the way in dealing with a lot of these histories that were written out of the history books, not just the trauma histories and the histories of women and the histories of civilians, but also, you know, the histories of sexualities. Quite a number of these women and some of the men were involved in same-sex relationships. And do I detect a hint of that?
Yes, you do. With Nell at the end.
Yes, you certainly do.
Oh, there's a little hint of that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I don't know, Mary, if you saw Embargo, which was my War of Independence play. We have a link to it that we can show you, but at the center of that is this fabulous character called Gracie, and he is a gay man who basically worked with a theatre troupe on the front during the First World War. And that's how he managed not to get killed, because he became one of those pin-up stars within the Munster Fusiliers, literally acting and dancing on the front to entertain the troops. But then when he comes back, he in Ireland, he's part of the Sinn Féin Republican movement, and he gets embroiled in the embargo, in that civil militancy. But because he does something that annoys the IRA, they tar and feather him. So and it's like they usually people just got a beating, but Gracie, for some reason, they tarred and feathered him, and I think that was undermining him because of his sexuality. Because, you know, so I'm just fascinated by by all of that.
Because very few men were tarred and feathered, but some were, and you wonder why they targeted those particularly.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely. And as you say,
I didn't see it, but I'd love if you'd send the link. I'd love to have it.
Indeed, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, as you say, so true what you say, that really it's about, you know, that what historians do, what artists do, what theatre companies do is ask questions and try and be fearless and brave about it and try and help provoke debate and and help facilitate that discussion that theatre, we hope, is a place, certainly, and this production hopefully is a place where those difficult issues can be discussed and explored, and even the audience will be seated on two sides on Marie Kern's beautiful set, kind of with a barricade in between them, and almost divided in the way that people were divided during the Civil War, looking at each other, looking at ourselves across the divide, and thinking about these issues and trying to come to terms with them, I suppose, 100 years on. So I just want to say thank you so much for this discussion, to you both, for being a part of us grappling with these issues and discussing the ideas behind them. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. We could go on all night chatting away. It's been such a pleasure.
I know.
But thanks so much to Dr. Mary
McAuliffe.
Thanks, Deirdre Kinahan. Well, if you have anything else to say, go for it. We'll meet again, hopefully. And
just that I'm really looking forward to seeing the production now. read the play.
Brilliant.
Great.
Thanks,
Okay.
Mary. Real
Excellent.
privilege. I'm a real fan of yours, I have to say.
Oh, yeah, it's lovely to have
Historians
you with us. It's
both
great.
terrify me and inspire me. I was going, oh God, I hope I got it right.
You weren't terrifying at all, Mary.
No.
It was great.
You're amazing. Thank you so much. Real privilege.
And thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mary.